Now we've already talked about ions for a bit, right? And how they form exactly. But now I'm reiterating it and just making it more and more complicated. Complicated not by adding more to do with ions, but how do they exactly behave because they do those certain things. What happens to sodium when it gets a plus charge? What next? What does it do next? We're going to focus on that. So a quick revision on that as well. So an atom becomes an ion when it loses or gains an electron. So you could have positive or negative ions. Sodium being in group 1 will always be positive, whereas chlorine on the other hand will always be negative. Because it's in group 7, it has 7 valence electrons, and it'll try its best to have one more. Let's see that in action right now. Now atoms are pretty simple beings. They have one rule, the octet rule, which we just talked about, and that's what they want to follow. Sodium has 1 electron in its outer shell, 1 electron only. So it could either gain 7 more electrons to, have 8 electrons in its outer shell, or the easier thing is, which it's kind of clever if you think about it, and these sodium atoms are really clever in that sense. They lose 1 electron and just attain a positive charge, and look, because what is really the shell, right? What is this? Because the shell is just where the electron is moving. If there's no electron, there's no really any shell, right? Like Earth's orbit is not a physical thing. It's just that the path Earth takes to revolve around the sun. That's what an orbit is. If you make the Earth disappear, there's no Earth's orbit anymore, right? So kind of like a shell, the shell goes away as well. So technically for sodium, it's very literal. If sodium had any better education, it would be a great lawyer, I guess. So technically it has 8 electrons in its outer shell now, just by losing 1. So I find that very clever for sodium to do. Just by losing 1, it can have 8 electrons in its outer shell. Very clever for sodium. Take care, let's move on. The sodium ion has 11 protons but 10 electrons, so the charge is positive 1, because it lost 1, right? So how you write this down is like this. Sodium with a positive charge. So a sodium metal has now turned into a sodium ion. Okay, let's move on. Chlorine has the exact opposite of the same problem what sodium has. Sodium and chlorine both don't have 8 electrons in their outer shell, but chlorine has up to 7 electrons in its outer shell, and what it can do is it can just gain 1 electron, just gain 1 electron, and it's done. Now at this point, this is kind of a forced example. Why am I talking about chlorine and sodium at the same time? Sodium really wants to lose an electron, chlorine really wants to gain an electron. Can we go somewhere with this? Sodium really wants to lose 1 electron, and chlorine really wants to gain 1 electron. Match made in heaven, right? So let's see in the next video how they end up doing this and what ends up happening to them.